I can't figure out if it's morning or afternoon right now. And I was on the elevator coming up into the conference, and I was running late. I went to the Kellogg Center instead of the Lansing Center. So I had a bit of a morning. I got in the elevator, and there's this lovely woman who obviously works at the center, and I'm like, does it feel like a Monday to you? Because it sure feels like a Monday to me. And she's like, yes. So my name is Sheldon Schwiddick. I've been doing a lot of work in Michigan for a long time, and currently I run a little consulting company that does training and technical assistance under a culture of gentleness as well as person-centered planning. Some of you I recognize. I'm really glad to be back in person. I did a lot of work for the Center for Positive Living Supports and a culture of gentleness for about a decade. Run a little consulting company called In the Company of Others, and just took a remote hybrid position for a friend of mine as the director of people and culture at an organization called Eros Group, which looks and supports people through supports brokerage rather than supports coordination or in conjunction with supports coordination. So pretty excited about that, working to connect people to community. You have to give us some grace. This is the first time that Jan and I have presented together, but I am super, super excited to be here today and working with her on this presentation. So if we stumble along a little ways, just give us a little bit of grace. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, and I'm Jan Lampman. I'm typically the one who's here for comedy relief, so the stumbling will probably just be funny to you. It'll be fine. And so let's see, how to introduce myself. Well, I am the sister of a lady whose name is Mary, who has received behavioral health supports for her entire life, for the most part. She is 70. She turned 70 in January, and she always gets mad at me when I say her age because it feels old to her, but she looks younger than me, and I'm a decade younger than her. So that just really, if that tells you anything. And I'm also the mother of 2 young men who were adopted out of the foster care system, who received behavioral health supports also. My middle child is, Tim, is a young man with autism, and then my youngest child has experienced some significant post-traumatic stress from the horrifying abuses that he experienced. So I have, I'm a parent and a sibling of people who receive services and supports, but I've also worked for pretty much my whole adult life in this field. For 38 years, I started as a direct support professional. One of my former supervisors in the back of the room there, when I worked with people as a direct care worker. And I've done just about every job in between. I've been an independent support coordinator, I've been an advocate, I've been a guardian, I've been a independent facilitator of person-centered planning. If you can think of a job that doesn't require a license, I've done it in the field. So my passion, though, I have 4 passions around this field. One of them is self-directed services and self-determination. Another one is really good quality person-centered planning. And then my third one is connected to that, and that is the valued role of a facilitator of that process that is independent from the other members of the circle, including case management, including the system. And then my 4th passion is, and this passion was developed out of having been someone's guardian, and that is supported decision making. So, you know, the beauty and the value of having your rights restored as a citizen and then getting the support you need to engage in the decision-making process, right? So those are my 4 passions, and today we're gonna mostly talk about, I guess, facilitation and bringing people together and the point of how we stay connected. So with that, we'll get out of the way.
Jan, I'm gonna throw a wrench in the works right away. I'm sorry, I got a hand at the back. Pardon? Oh, the code in.
Oh, the code in. Oh, that's
code
right.
in.
I know nothing of this.
I got it.
But I know you get some
Code in
CEUs.
is 35.
35 is the code in. All right.
So you haven't even seen this slide, so.
Okay, that's fine.
Actually, there's 2 of them. So how many of you have been in a training with me before? There's a couple of you. Well, one of you, a couple, right? I really love poetry. I think it's actually a really great way to get people grounded into the space. And this is one of my favorite poems that I read at the beginning of a lot of trainings. It's called To Be of Use. The people I love the best jump into the work head first, without dallying in the shallows, and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves, an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire must be put out. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry and a person for work that is real. I had to add this slide after being in the presentation this morning because I've been having this ongoing conversation. There's a group of us who meet and we're calling ourselves the Person-Centered Think Tank of Michigan and really thinking about what it might take to really bring this to the fore. And one of the things that keeps coming up for us is this difference between a person-centered plan and an individualized plan of service. How many people see those things as the same thing? Good, I'm glad I'm in a room full of people that don't. Because a person-centered plan is actually the big dreams of a person and how they want to go about having a life in the world. And the individualized plan of service is the plan that the system utilizes to make sure the person has access to what they need in order to move forward in their life. And we're going to be talking a lot about person-centered plans as opposed to plans of service, although those will get woven into this a little bit as well.
So Michigan, am I on? I'm on. Okay, so Michigan kind of was in the early days of my career, we're just gonna go in the life of me for a moment here, but in the early days of people being out of the institutions, right? Michigan was kind of a leader among the 50, among the 50 states. Sorry, I have terrible allergies, and the smoke from the wildfires is making it worse. I just wanted to share that with all of you so you don't think you're going to get sick from me. So Michigan was an early adopter of person-centered planning, this idea of person-centered planning as something that we should put in our law, right? So we were one of the first states in the union that actually put the requirement for person-centered planning to occur in our mental health code. And then another thing that we were early adopters of is self-determination, and we have, obviously, as you all know, we have a policy, a state policy on self-determination, and that it's something that should be offered to every person who, is receiving supports and services. Michigan was one of 19 states in the late 1990s that received funding from a Robert Woods Johnson grant. The Robert Woods Johnson Foundation gave us and 18 other states money to figure out what self-determination could look like, what it meant when you gave control and authority to people to guide their own lives and actually to have some authority over the services that they receive to live their lives. And so we are definitely leaders in that. And so our self-determination policy says, right, that self-determination shall be established in each community mental health program for adults with developmental disabilities and adults with mental illness. And our person-centered planning practice and guideline states that person-centered planning is a process, right, for supporting and planning and supporting the individual receiving services that builds on that person's capacity to engage in activities that promote community life and honors that person's preferences, choices, and abilities, right? So person-centered planning is supposed to focus on the good life that person wants to lead, right? And what is our plan of service supposed to do? It's supposed to provide some services that help the person get there, right? So we're going to just talk about a little bit of history and context, right? We've already said this twice, and we're going to say it a third time. Person-centered planning is a process, right? It's not that document. It's not a meeting. It's not even a series of meetings. Person-centered planning is this way of thinking about how we engage together and how we move forward in life. At lunch, I was sitting with a gentleman who had a little circle, and person-centered planning is this little circle, right? That just you keep going right back to the beginning, right? So you're always doing it. It's also a tool for learning, right? When we are engaging in good person-centered planning, we're learning about each other, right? Maybe you as case holders are learning about the person you serve. The person you serve is learning about the other people in their circle. You're learning about your community. Community members are learning about you, right? It's a learning tool. Did I not do the last one? And then the other piece is that person-centered planning, real person-centered planning, brings people together with communities and the system, right? So it's not just a system tool, it's not just a community tool, but it's a tool where we all can come together around this person who we want to champion and who we want to support to have a good life. Okay.
So an origin story is how Jan has been describing this, and it's actually part of our origin story too, this woman, Judith Snow. How many of you in the room know who she is? A couple of you, right? So Judith Snow is actually the person in many ways who also started it all as far as person-centered planning, circles of support, and really this idea of inclusion and giftedness that we actually take for granted in the work that we do now. She was a pioneer in all of those. I was lucky enough to meet Judith Snow pretty early on in my career in this sector. I met her as part of an organization called Inclusion Press and the Marcia Forrest Center. Judith actually was somebody who kind of led the way in figuring out how to have individualized services. She was living in hang on. I'm going to take a step back. Right, Judith had something called spinal muscular atrophy, and was continuing to lose the ability to move her body around, and ended up in a nursing home, which in the 80s was about the only place that she could live. She also, at the same time, though, was going to York University, was studying philosophy, and paired up with our dear friend Marcia Forrest. Judith's day looked like she would leave the nursing home before they served breakfast. They were nice enough to pack her a lunch, and she often wouldn't get home until after dinner was served and the kitchen was closed. And so she would sit and have lunch with Marcia. Marcia was teaching at York at the time, and Marcia, in her just Marcia way, would be also eating off of Judith's plate while they were talking and having lunch. She was fascinated with Judith and really thinking about education and wanted to learn from her. And one day, Judith showed up, and she was not talking. And being a good friend of hers, that is definitely a huge alarm bell. And so Marcia went home and talked to her husband, Jack, and they called a number of people, and they said, we need to get her the hell out of there. So they went to the institution. They figured out how to load her into the car, how to load the chair into the back of their back seat of the vehicle that they had, or the trunk, I don't even remember which. Brought her home, carried her up 2 huge flights of stairs, and plunked her in their guest room. And then created what we now know as the first circle of support. They called on their friends and family and said, we have this person, she's really struggling, we know that she needs something different and services aren't serving her. How do we make that happen? And advocated with the Canadian government, with the government of Ontario, to get her individualized supports that were funneled through a local college that Jack was teaching at. I was lucky enough to meet Judith not long after that, and she became one of my very, very dear friends. In fact, we actually, in Judith, in the way that she can operate in the world, can make things happen in ways, and she's a manifester in ways that I still am flabbergasted by. We managed to buy a house together in downtown Toronto in what's now called the Roncesvalles Village for $250,000, no money down. $250,000 in the, I guess that was in the late 90s. And that's just an expression of who she is and how she is in the world. The thing that I loved about living with her and that I really learned from is that she lived this idea that we all have gifts and bring them together. That house was a huge house. I think it had one, two, three, four, had 5 bedrooms, and then because we didn't have an elevator in it, we actually converted the living room, dining room into a bedroom for Judith. So there were 6 bedrooms, and there were at least 4 of us living in the house. 2 of those people also needed full-on 24-hour support, so caregivers coming and going, had a dog, and she figured out how to make that life work. She knew that I was not the person who would do things on a regular basis. Like, I was not the person who was going to sweep the kitchen floor every day, but I was the person who was responsible for maintaining the house. Helped to get a ramp built, redid our garden so it was accessible, kind of bigger projects, right? And then she figured out, like Matt's staff, one of the people that you'll meet a little bit later who we were living with, his staff was responsible for some of the day-to-day stuff and some grocery shopping. Her staff was responsible for other day-to-day stuff and making that happen. And so I tell that story to say that this idea of being individualized and individualized supports for people and planning with people comes from the day-to-day living of that life. And it's where I really embedded in me that this isn't just for people with disabilities, right? We all do person-centered planning for ourselves. We all bring people together to make big decisions in our life, and it is an ongoing process. So I'm gonna actually let her talk for herself for a minute here.
They said, she will never walk. She will die before she is 4, before she is 6. She will always live with her parents. There is no point in her going to school. You will never have any friends. You will die before you are 30. Your kind belongs in chronic care. You can't travel. You will die within the next 6 months. You don't understand how it works. This isn't art. They were right. I never did learn how to walk.
Judith went on to be an international traveler, had worked, the organization that I worked for when I first worked with my friend Matt and was supporting him, supported her as well, created a circle of 12 circles of support that built that organization. And what was the other thing that I was gonna say? It just flew out of my head. She actually never learned how to walk, but she learned how to retrain her thumb. She, for a long time, had the use of a thumb so that she could control her wheelchair and continued to do so, although it became more erratic for her to drive it. So she got a puff and sip system. She could also type faster than me with a puff and sip using Morse code. So all of the things they said, that was the other thing I was gonna say. She went on to live to be a ripe old age of 66, passed it away in her sleep, happy in an apartment, and continued to pontificate about what it meant to be inclusive and what it meant to be included. And I'm grateful for her every day. So there is a ton of stuff online. Judith has a couple of blogs that are still up and running. There's a bunch of videos of hers. She is well worth taking a look into. I was doing a training earlier this week and was singing the praises of Judith, because in some ways she was the birth of what we know as inclusion and the inclusion practices we have. And then Jan also has a pretty significant connection.
So Judith came to Michigan in 1980, I want to say 88, might have been 1987. And she was at the ARC Michigan Conference in Kalamazoo. Jill was there. I was there were you there, Jill? I went with Tom Williams. I went with my friend Tom Williams because I was working in a group home at the time, and Tom lived in the group home, and we got, I don't know, the ARC of Midland sent us, so we went. But another person was at the conference too, and his name was Tim Bartlett, and I'm going to talk about him in a minute. But Judith told her story. She told the story that Sheldon just told in quite a bit of detail. And one of the things that was really like, I think that really, she was an excellent storyteller. You heard her read that poem, right? When she told stories, people were on the edge of their seat, right? And so she's telling her story, and the way she characterized it, the day she came to school without talking, is that she had given up and she was just done. That's what she said. She was done. So she was surely not going, she was going to, make that prediction about the 30, right? The age 30, when the gang picked her up and rescued her from that facility. But the other part that she talked about that was so, that grabbed us here in the state of Michigan, that grabbed the imaginations of people with disabilities and their families most especially, was she talked about how when her friends took her to their apartment, nobody knew how she was going to get supported for the long term outside of that nursing home. They knew they could do it for a short period of time. They were all kind of taking turns helping Judith with what she needed, but they knew that wasn't the long-term solution. And so a little subcommittee of her circle began to do some advocacy with the Ontario government. What is it called? The provincial government. I had to think of what it was called. The Ontario provincial government, to try to get some money that had been going to that nursing home where she was, right? To try to, hey, let's just try this. Let's just, do a little pilot, whatever they said, whatever magic words they used, right? And they got this money that they then were able to hire some support and help Judith in that way, right? Well, what happened is the provincial government saw how Judith's how her life changed, right? Her health outcomes became better. She was contributing. She went to work. She was a wage earner. All these wonderful things started happening, and that really changed the system in Ontario, right? Because then what the provincial government said was, "Hey, this seems like a better use of dollars. Let's create some programming where more than just one person can do this," right? And it changed the whole system in Ontario and then later in Canada. So she comes and she tells the story in Michigan. And at that time, my friend Tim Bartlett, you want to flip it to Tim? Well, that's how we can segue to Tim. My friend Tim Bartlett and his parents were sitting in the audience. And at that time, Tim's family had been told that, we're really trying to figure out how to get people out of the institutions, so we don't have a lot of resource for people who never went to them. And so we don't really have a lot to offer you in our systems of care. And that was true back in those days. You could get a little bit of respite, and that was kind of about it. And Tim wanted what Judith had. He heard her story about how she's living in her own place, and she's making money, doing things she likes to do, and she's got all these friends, right? He heard that, and he wanted that. And his parents heard that, and what they heard was, wait a minute, she and her circle changed the way the system worked. Wonder if we couldn't, based on what Tim would like his life to look like, change how the system works. And so Judith, when I think about Michigan's origin story, for me personally, maybe because I was in the room with my friend Tom, because he was also similarly inspired, I feel like that's our origin story, is that conference when Judith Snow came and talked about her circle and how her circle helped her figure out some things that not only changed her life, but changed her community and changed, in fact, the whole way the system worked in her community. And so that's exactly what happened. So Tim Bartlett, he came home with his parents, and they said, Judith talked about a circle of friends. We need to get one of those circle things going. And so the Bartletts sat down, and they started writing a list of all the people they knew that they thought that cared about Tim, that they thought could be of help in some way, shape, or form. And they invited about 160 people to that first circle. 160 people. Myrna was well, she's kind of a busybody, so she knew everybody in town. But she also was a caterer, so she knew lots of people, for all kinds of reasons. They had lived in the same neighborhood their whole married lives, so they had all the neighbors, right? They had 3 other children who had a whole group of friends, who were young adults, right, who had a whole group of friends. They were members of the local chapter of the ARC, and so they invited other parents, right, from that parent organization. Myrna was thinking ahead. She goes, well, Tim says he wants to live in his own place, so we might have to invite a realtor. We might need a realtor. I mean, Myrna was a plotter and a planner, if any of you ever met her. So they invited a realtor. They also realized that one of the things that the group had talked about, that Judith had talked about, was changing some rules. So they thought, we're going to invite that young Dave Camp. He's running for state representative, and if he gets elected, maybe he could help us. So they invited this young man who was running for office to the circle. 160 people, all walks of life. That first circle, and I got invited, and here's why. I wasn't working in the field yet. Well, I was working in a group home, but I got invited because I'd met Tim before I was working in the field because his sister was dating my boyfriend at the time's best friend, and so we were all hanging out together. So I knew Tim, kind of. So I was, by this point, not yet working at the ARC, but I was working in the group homes, and I got invited, so I got to witness it. 100 people showed up to that first meeting. They had it at a church. We thought we were going to be in one little room, and it ended up needing to be in a bigger room because 100 people showed up because they were kind of curious and interested in wondering, what is the Bartlett's up to now, right? And so that circle, that 160-person circle, because every time they invited all 160, and different people showed up different times, right? That group of people began to listen to Tim, and this is what happened. That group of people said, we want to hear what you want, Tim. We want to hear what your dreams are. We want to hear what it is you want to accomplish, right? And so Tim started articulating those dreams, and I'll tell you what they were in a nutshell, although it evolved over time, but here's what it was in a nutshell. He wanted to live in his own place like his other siblings. He wanted to join a fraternity. Don't ask me why he wanted to do that, but it was a thing he wanted to do. So, how many people are fraternity or sorority people? Are there any? Okay, so you all probably know exactly why he wanted to join a fraternity, but he wanted to do that. He wanted to have a business. He wanted to be able to travel to hotels where they have pools, and they're very specific, and he wanted to be able to be in his neighborhood where he always had lived, where he knows people and people know him. Those were his basic dreams. Very simple. And yet very unattainable for a person who also, like Judith, was predicted not to live past 6 months, then not to live past 4 years, then not to live past, the age of 20. Tim passed away at 46. So he also outpaced the predictions, right? And so this group of I got to watch on the sidelines as this group of 160 people figured some things out for Tim. And the first thing they figured out is Tim wants to live in his neighborhood. Somebody in the circle said, hey, I heard that the people that live next door to me are thinking about selling their house. Let's ask them if they really are. And if they are, let's just ask them if they'd sell their house to Tim. So a couple circle members went there, asked them, and they said, yeah, we're selling our house, and sure, we'd love for Tim to buy our house. So then the circle members say, well, he doesn't have any money just yet. So do you think you could just maybe rent it to him for a little while we try to figure out the money? And I don't know how this happened, but they said, sure, we can do that. And so there we go. Now Tim's got a house. Then we had to figure out how Tim would get the support he needed. He needed someone with him all of the time because his muscles they used to call it floppy baby syndrome. And what it is your muscles your muscles just never develop, right? So everything's weak, your heart's weak, your diaphragm's weak, so it's hard to breathe. There's lots of health implications. So he needed someone with him all the time. So one of the other people in the circle was I don't know what she was. She was something at Northwood that worked with the fraternities and sororities, whatever that job is. And she said, I wonder if I have a couple of my fraternity guys that don't want to live in the frat house that would be interested in living with Tim. Sure enough, 2 young men, Harry and Craig, said, yeah, sure, we would like to live with Tim. And so they moved in to Tim's house. They each paid a little bit of rent. Tim paid a little bit of rent. It covered the cost of the house. And they agreed that one of them would always be home at night to be with Tim. So only one of them would go to the big party at a time because one of them was always home with Tim at night. And then Myrna discovered that there was this program called Adult Home Help that was mainly for senior citizens that maybe broke a leg or something who were on Medicaid, but she didn't see anywhere in the rules that it was really only for the aging population. So she convinced the Department of Health and Human Services to come out and do an assessment on Tim, and he got 8 hours a day of home help. And then that's when we went to the CMH and said, we just need we need some money for a couple hours a day here to fill this little gap we got going. And so Art Letourneau, who was the director of DD Services at the time, said, I've got some general fund dollars, and I'm going to let you have them, but please don't tell anyone because I'm not really sure if it's 100% kosher to have somebody who needs as much help as Tim live in a non-licensed facility. Now, some of us had already looked up the law and the rules around licensing, and we knew that it would be okay. I actually said to Art, I said, Art, Madonna has 24/7 staff at her house. Nobody says that has to be licensed, so, and he was like, oh, yeah, that's true, good point. And so, anyway, so he gave us a little bit of general fund money, and so then Tim was able to hire some staff to help him with some things he needed help with. We didn't tell anyone, our Art said not to tell, so we didn't tell anyone that we got the money. However, Myrna loves to celebrate because that's a very important part also of real person-centered planning, is celebrating. And so the family, the Bartlett family, threw a big block party to celebrate Tim moving into his own home, and she thought it would be really cool to invite people like the director of the Department of Community Health, which is what it was called back in those days, and, you know, by this point, our friend Dave Camp had actually gotten elected, so he was invited. You know, people that were in policy-making roles, and they came. They came to check this thing out. And so when the deputy director of Department of Community Health was walking up the sidewalk towards Tim's house, Art Letourneau was standing there, and you could see his face just turn white as a ghost, because he was like, oh my gosh, the department's going to find out what I did with this general fund money. But you know what? The department thought it was awesome. They were very amazed, very happy, very pleased, and they, in fact, gave our community a grant to do more of it. So we got to do more of it with other families and other people in other circles, and it looked different for everyone because everyone had different dreams and goals, right? And needed different amounts of support or needed their support to look different ways. And then it started spreading to other communities, right? And so when I think about our origin story, it starts with Judith and her telling a story. And then it continues with people like Tim and others throughout the state of Michigan taking what they learned, right? Taking what they learned and going out and learning together in their own communities. And that is, in fact, what has changed the way, we provide services in this state. That all of that learning and thinking about doing something differently and taking a few risks here and there, I will always be grateful to Art Letourneau for taking that risk with that little bit of money for Tim, right? And so when we are engaging in person-centered planning, what is the most important part of that? Bringing people together to learn about each other, from each other, and to make change, not just for the life of the person you support, but maybe change for your whole community, right? And so that's Tim's story. Tim did a vehicle. He did get his own house. He did join the fraternity, the Teeks. Does anybody know the Teeks? Tim was a Teek, and so he was able to join that fraternity because of Northwood University, and his two housemates were in that fraternity. He was a real legit member, and when he died, his funeral was held at the biggest Methodist church in town, First United Methodist, you're in Midland, First United Methodist Church, and they had to have the TVs on in the basement, and there were people standing outside, because you know what, when you're in a fraternity and you die, this makes me sad. I get sad when I talk about Tim. But when you're in a fraternity and you die, any fraternity member that's nearby comes to your funeral. And so there were all these Teeks from all over the place that showed up for Tim, right? And so when I think about who his circle, Dave Camp was by now a United States congressman, and he gave the eulogy, right? So, you know, sometimes like when you think about who shows up at your funeral, right? It kind of speaks about what kind of life you led. And Tim led a very full life. His church was full of people that loved him and that he loved. So that's the story of Tim. If you want to go to the next slide, please.
So how do we segue this, right? This is the question. This idea of facilitation, if you think about Tim's story and you think about Judith's story, who were the facilitators of that person's plan? Who facilitated that? They did. Right, and then all of the people around them helped to facilitate parts of it, right? And many of them were from outside. So Myrna helping Tim, Myrna reached out to people that she knew could facilitate other parts of it. What we do know is really helpful when we're facilitating plans for people is sometimes it's good to have somebody who doesn't have anything invested in the situation to be able to hold all of the threads that are carried from that person out into the community and the people who belong and support them. Does that make sense? So this idea of independent facilitation is one that is actually written into the mental health code and probably the most underutilized resource that people have available to them in Michigan. Jan has been doing independent facilitation for a number of years now. I haven't been doing an awful lot of it, but I'm hoping to in the future. But these are all these are critical to really good person-centered planning. And I'm going to hand it back over to you because it's your slide.
Okay, sure. So what is the role of the facilitator? Well, in Tim's story, that facilitator was our friend Rebecca Schumann for many years, and then when she left Midland, I took over as the facilitator of that circle. And for Tim, having someone that wasn't like part of his closest inner circle to facilitate the process, to make sure that we remember everything we said we were going to do, to make sure that we really followed through on what we said we were going to do, to make sure the people Tim wanted to invite were invited, to, you know, make sure there were good snacks, all the things, was really, really important. And so when we think about what made Judith's circle a success, what makes Tim's circle a success, what really helps people to maintain their focus, maintain their energy, oftentimes we see that it's that independent facilitator who comes in and is just really your job is to keep the energy up, is to help to bring people together, is to make sure that there's a record of what people said they were going to do, right? All those things. And so independent facilitation is, I think, a really critical role that someone can play. And I think I'm standing in a weird spot. Here we go. So a couple things about facilitators. You know, you want to make sure that it's somebody that the person whose life it is has chosen, or that they, you know, that they want to invite into the circle. I also want to, I've sometimes heard people say that, like, well, a facilitator is like a neutral party, like a mediator. And that's not true. A facilitator is not a neutral party. A facilitator is a champion for that focus person and their dreams and goals, and a champion for that circle of people, right, that are going to help them achieve those goals. So facilitation isn't meant to be like something that when it's adversarial, you bring in a facilitator. I mean, you could when it's that, but the facilitator's job is to bring everyone together around the shared vision that person has, right? So I share your vision and I want to support you in it. So the facilitator is going to help me to do that, right? And the person who is a facilitator is really responding directly to what the person